Iran has been sanctioned by the West since 1979, and the comparison of the political calendar of the Islamic Republic since its establishment in 1979 with the calendar of discussions and sanctions of the international community demonstrates explicitly that sanctions have become a real obsession for America and the West, to the point of appearing to be their only diplomatic instrument. It then appears that it was to trap Iran, that the Europeans, acting as proxies of America, itself under very strong pressure from Israel, proposed to Iran in 2003 to begin exchanges, then discussions concerning its nuclear program. The ulterior motive was to try to draw Tehran into an escalation of concessions under penalty of massive sanctions, the overall goal being the reduction to a minimum of its civil nuclear ambitions and to force it to give up its military prospects. The external application of this geopoliticization of the law of sanctions by the West, essentially the United States, has borne fruit vis-à-vis third countries, its European allies. Indeed, Europe's losses in the face of American secondary sanctions against Iran are counted in multiple areas. In particular, Iran has signed contracts with three French car brands, Peugeot, Renault, and Citroën. After the nuclear deal, Peugeot and Renault were among the most important European companies that entered the Iranian market, but were forced to leave Iran following the U.S. withdrawal from the deal. The Peugeot Group had announced in its statement that its global sales volume decreased by 15.7% in the first quarter of 2019, the main reason for it being the suspension of the group's activities in Iran. Likewise, the Italian brand Fiat, which had sought to acquire a 15% stake in the Iranian national automobile industry, was also forced to leave Iran. However, there is a great desire in Iran to use foreign cars due to the lack of quality in the domestic automobile industry, as well as to the challenges to the delivery of spare parts due to the U.S. sanctions. National companies need partnerships with foreign automobile companies for spare parts, technology transfer, and to restore their images. Another example refers to gas supplies. Iran has the capacity to produce more than 1 billion cubic meters of gas daily. Total had launched a $5 billion project for the development of South Pars field. If the U.S. sanctions were lifted, Iran could have become Europe's most important gas partner. However, given the U.S. sanctions, the risk of transporting oil and gas to international destinations is great. The 90% dependence of the maritime insurance industry on Western companies, such as Astral and Parismet France, has caused a decrease in the sale of Iranian oil and an increase in demand and price. Other examples include the solar industry with Saga's $3 billion deal to build a solar power plant, and the Airbus aviation sector, which had a $25 billion contract to supply jets to Iran Air. According to statistics from the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the European Commission in 2017, China, the European Union, India, the United Arab Emirates, UAE, and South Korea were Iran's top 5 partners, respectively. Thus, the value of total trade between Iran and the European Union was equal to $20.9 billion, of which $10.8 billion represented the value of EU exports to Iran and $10.1 billion the value of EU imports from Iran. Yet the attitude of the United States of America illustrates the pattern of power according to which the strongest imposes its law on the weakest, resorting to illegal maneuvers, exercising blackmail on all the actors of international society, and resorting to a series of sanctions with extraterritorial effects in violation of the principles of public international law, the opposite of what would be true countermeasures in recent years. Current unilateral coercive measures constitute true acts of economic war. For example, Washington has chosen the path of the blockade against Iran, which is similar to a real state of siege using the weapon of secondary sanctions. Dominating the global economic system since the establishment of the Bretton Woods system, the United States has used this unchallenged ascendancy to establish, through unilateral extraterritorial measures, monetary hegemony through the use of the U.S. dollar in international transactions, control over SWIFT, etc., and its political authority over international bodies and authorities such as the UN Security Council, NATO, etc. With the New World Order resulting from the fall of communism, and its status as the only hyperpower since the early 1990s, The United States has led the entire international society to become accustomed to its domination and practice, as much towards those states that it considers its enemies as towards its competitors and even its allies. Engaging in true acts of political and economic war, affecting both the sanctioned states or entities in a direct manner, as well as other states and international actors in an indirect, secondary manner. The unilateral measures taken by this country cannot borrow the terminology of sanctions in view of the objective and purpose of these sanctions. The U.S. is supplementing legality with an attempt to claim legitimacy, but their measures are not legal. In addition to legality, they must have a legitimate objective, in accordance with that of the United Nations and the principles of public international law, which the United States constantly violates. The example of the progressive sanctions pressure applied against Iran illustrates this denial of law and return of political violence. Against Iran, to which we can now add Russia, this strategy of accumulating sets of sanctions will not cease. In March 1995, Washington decreed an oil embargo against the Islamic Republic, followed by an economic one, and in 1996 by the vote approving the Amato-Kennedy Law, which prohibits any contract exceeding $20 million. In 2003, Washington took on aeronautical and scientific issues and raised suspicions concerning the existence of a nuclear and military program developed by Tehran. It was its European allies who proposed a dialogue in the form of exchanges of views or information on non-proliferation. But, in reality, the Iranian nuclear issue was thus created in 2003, with the real objective of a rapid escalation, the conditions imposed on the negotiators becoming increasingly harsh to the point of no longer being acceptable. In 2005, the Iranian president would cancel the concessions made by his predecessor concerning restrictions on the civil nuclear program, inspections, etc. The United States entered the process by demanding the tightening of pre-existing sanctions and new embargoes in 2006, then 2007, on weapons, equipment for communication, law enforcement, and nuclear power, in particular reactors, but also financial services, etc. It is therefore a question of forcing Iran to sign an agreement in line with the demands of the West, since Russia and China offer a series of more balanced proposals, taking up those of the Iranian theses, factors of appeasement. The punitive methodology of sanctions has been put in place and likely will never fall back since the escalation continues. With the imposition of a new wave of measures in 2012, designed to asphyxiate Iran if it does not give in, the true design of the West is revealed. The European Union decreed an embargo on hydrocarbons, mining equipment, naval equipment, precious metals, as well as a block on the assets of the Iranian state and its banks. Access for air freight transport from Iran is prohibited, as is the supply of aircraft spare parts, etc. Then came the restriction on Iran's use of foreign financial services for oil exports, then the transfer of technology in terms of armament related to nuclear weapons. In 2013, the U.S. Congress voted for a new strengthening of sanctions. The cumulative effect of the sanctions revealed the desire not just to establish a balance of power, but a destructive intention. But on July 14, 2015, Iran, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, plus Germany and the European Union, signed the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, in Vienna. The UN and EU embargoes were to be eased, and by the way, replaced by measures that strengthened the control of the Security Council. The freeze on financial assets and those concerning the trade in hydrocarbons were lifted by the European Union, but they were maintained by the United States. 2.5 years later, in March 2018, the American president decided to unilaterally withdraw from the nuclear agreement. All sanctions were reinstated. Embargo on oil, aeronautics, and the mining sector, as well as the ban on the use of the dollar in transactions with Iran. In July 2018, the Iranian Minister of Foreign Affairs filed and addressed a complaint to International Court of Justice, ICJ, but the United States challenged its jurisdiction. Nevertheless, on October 3, 2018, 15 judges of the ICJ ruled that the withdrawal from the JCPOA constituted a violation of the Treaty of Friendship signed in 1955 between the United States and Iran. In 2019, new sanctions were imposed. The revenues of the Central Bank of Iran and the sovereign wealth funds of the National Development Fund were frozen, decisions that the American president claims are the most severe sanctions ever imposed on a country. On February 21st, 2020, in Paris, the FATF, Financial Action Task Force, responsible for legal standards and measures to combat money laundering and terrorism financing, called on its members to take countermeasures against Iran based on Palermo Convention. Washington announced the unilateral reestablishment of all sanctions. The effects of extraterritorial sanctions. Extraterritorial sanctions undermine the international legal order, in particular jus cogens, like, for example, the human rights enshrined in the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The violation of human rights. The fundamental rights of the Iranian people, such as the right to health, the right to food, and the right to development, have been affected 31 by the enactment of these measures, which in reality constitute massive violations of fundamental rights, which we have been witnessing for decades. The reality of sanctions is not limited to the freezing of bank assets or the blocking of fund transfers. It raises the question of the survival of an entire population, in particular its weakest and most deprived fringe. In light of both the intensity and the duration of the application of the sanctions affecting the country. The right to development is an inalienable human right by which every human person and all peoples have the right to participate and contribute to an economic, social, cultural, and political development in which all human rights and fundamental freedoms are respected. These fundamental rights have been directly affected by the hostile and unilateral actions of the United States, which have worrying effects on human rights. Regarding Iran, Mike Pompeo declared in November 2018 that the government in Tehran will have to make the right choice regarding U.S. sanctions if it wants its people to eat. Sanctions can be deadly. Those taken against Iraq under the leadership of the United States and Israel cost the lives of more than 1 million people between 1991 and 2003, including nearly 500,000 children, according to UNICEF figures. For Madeleine Albright, the price was worth it. 33. This means in both cases that, for the United States, the idea of making a civilian population suffer as a collective punishment for the actions of its governments is compatible with the legal principles governing the decision of unilateral extraterritorial sanctions. This process of coercive diplomacy gives a clear conscience without risk, which Michael Mandelbaum summarized as punishing the innocent to express one's indignation to the guilty. Today, sanctions come directly from hell. Sanctions from hell, or apocalyptic, as the Americans say, because the goal is to create an untenable situation, real suffering for civilian populations, so that they rebel against their government or even overthrow it. Means and objectives totally opposed to the objectivity and prudential virtue of justice inherent in decisions emanating from public international law. The return of power relationships in place of law via the framework of unilateral coercive measures, now deteriorated in all its facets, intrinsic violence, escalation, successive and cumulative effects, permanence of the embargo situation, indirect destruction of infrastructures, etc., leads to consequences in practical order. The populations concerned see that the impact on economic issues such as small industry, the import of basic necessities and agriculture, but also social and cultural areas such as the healthcare system, the environment, and education are subject to an impact external to common law. The punishment by rejection, the brutal and disproportionate downgrading of an entire society, the humanitarian impact and the social repercussions at the personal and collective level of the sanctions against Iran in the service of dominant American geopolitical interests is a negation of international human and economic rights. The coercion resulting from the sanctions has indeed multiple aspects and violates international economic and social law on a daily basis, in that it blindly generalizes the effects on all industrial, commercial, and craft sectors, while the aspects of transport, taxes and insurance costs, distribution, export, customs duties, and spare parts are particularly targeted and are suffocating and disappearing without the appearance of subsistence replacements. Coercion and hindrance to trade and transactions by direct effect currency, or indirect effect, impoverishment of the state's social services, do not respect international economic and social law. They push heads of families to despair at not being able to ensure the minimum subsistence of their loved ones. The real impact on populations when their government is the target of these sanctions multiplies and is embodied in all aspects of their daily lives, whether it is the health system, as neonatal and early childhood services are the most affected, or the lack of places, resources, care materials, particularly in surgery and medicines. But the shortage due to lack of cash, the side effect again, obviously also affects the ability to ensure the financing of emergency social housing as well as the reception of refugees, estimated to be 5 million on Iranian territory. Due to sanctions, particularly on spare parts, food security and human rights, which should include the right to maintenance, are difficult to ensure in Iran. They seriously threaten the food supply of populations as it concerns storage and detection of natural disasters, drought and floods.